behind me the snow-capped peaks of the Andes here in Chile. They rise to about an average of 13,000 feet. Now far away from here, way over in Armenia, is a mountain that rises to 17,000 feet. That is Mount Ararat. And that's the mountain we're going to look at and looking for Noah's Ark. The search for Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. And we know the story is in Genesis chapters 6 through 8, that man was wicked and told Noah to build the ark. This is a piece of gopher wood that a friend of mine gave me. We don't fully know what gopher wood actually was, but we believe it was something like white oak, which is probably what this is, or cypress, a very tough wood. And that's what they used for Noah's Ark. Also, some people who went to Noah's Ark and saw it said that some of the wood seemed to be using a sort of plywood type process, like several layers put together, making it even tougher and more flexible. And Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, 8 people total, went into the ark, and they brought in 2 of each animal, and also 7 or 14, depending how you translate it, of each clean animal. Then there was heavy rain for 40 days with the earth completely covered, and the water then slowly receded. After 150 days, the ark rested on Mount Ararat. And as the water continued to recede, the tops of the mountains were seen after 220 days. And then Noah sent out both the raven and the dove around the 260-day mark. They both returned. Noah sent out the dove, and it returns with an olive branch, and that was at about the 267-day mark. And then Noah removed the ark covering and seized dry ground at 309 days at that point. And the earth dried out, and Noah and his family and animals leave the ark at 364 days. That's approximate. I mean, it depends how you view a year, and they used a lunar calendar back in those days, so some people say it might be a little more or less. But generally, you can know that Noah, his family, and the animals were all in the ark about 1 year. And then we see in Genesis 8:4, and on the 17th day of the 7th month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. So at about the 4,000 to 5,000 meter level of Big Mount Ararat, in an area called the Ahora Gorge, there is a very large wooden-like structure broken into 2 or 3 pieces at this point. It is usually buried under much ice and snow. And that's what we're going to be talking about, the search for this Noah's Ark. And there's many different things people discuss about Noah's Ark. For example, how could all the animals fit in the ark? That's often an argument brought forth by non-believers. Well, part of the problem of this argument, or the reason for it, is pictures like you see there. You know, you get this little yacht-sized, funny-looking boat with animals and, typically a giraffe with its head popping out the window and some elephants, and they're all crowded in this cute little boat with cute little Noah. And anyone who's been to Sunday school has probably been subjected to these sort of things. Now you can say, well, this is just a childlike way to portray the ark, and we know things can be cute and simplified for children, but at the same time, this seems to be just kind of not taking the whole thing seriously. Honestly, I wonder how many of the people who have made these books were really believers, or really believers in a literal flood. Probably a number of them were not. And so this is the sort of treatment we get. And so we're kind of brought up to see this as kind of a funny Bible fable. Another aspect of the argument is if you look at all the living organisms in the world, the different types of organisms and species and so on. Some have even ranked that number up in the millions. And then they'll say, well, you know, you had all these animals, and of course, every animal has many different types. Like, look at these different types of longhorn cattle type animals. And then you look at all these different types of cats. And so you'd have to have all these different things in the ark. But actually, that number, when they talk about the millions, it counts sea creatures, which were not in the ark. It talks down to cellular forms, which obviously could just be floating around the air anyway. Those wouldn't have to be officially housed in the ark. And insects as well, which could easily either survive the flood and fly around and land on debris, or just fly into the ark. So then you look at the aspect of kinds. Genesis 6:19-20. You are to bring into the ark 2 of all living creatures, male and female, to keep them alive with you. 2 of every kind of bird, of every kind of animal, and every kind of creature that moves along the ground will come to you to be kept alive. So, for example, you look at, here are the dogs of the world, some of the major breeds of dogs. You would not have to have all these different ones on the ark. You wouldn't have to have a pug and a bulldog and a Doberman Pinscher and all these different types. You only would need to have 2 dogs. And those 2 dogs probably looked like this. Because if you've been to different countries where there are street dogs, they typically have that average brown look to them. But I imagine if you took 2 of these street dogs and you bred them, and then you separated their breeds out into colors and types, and you could eventually come up with these different breeds of dogs, at least some of them, depending where you found the street dogs. So all the different kinds of dogs and kinds of cats and cattle and so on could have come just from one pair of that animal, requiring less. Here's a count of animals on the ark that's estimated. Now, mammals, we could be looking at 1,644 different sorts of mammals, but if you just look at the kinds, like I said, 2 dogs, for example, that'd be 1 dog, 546. Or birds, 3,676. Kinds of birds, 284. Reptiles, 928 different ones, but kinds of reptiles that could multiply into and be bred into those, 320. Animals, 496, but kinds, 248. So you only need 248 kinds of animals. So total would be 6,744 animals, but really we only would require about 1,398 kinds of animals. So you could have 1,400 kinds existing times 2, because you have a pair of each, 2,800 plus 14 of each clean animal. You're looking at, this is an approximate total of 6,800 animals that will be marched into the ark, and that is quite doable. And some people wonder, well, what about the dinosaurs? You know, these gigantic Tyrannosaurus rexes and, you know, brontosauruses and things that would be taking up all sorts of space. Well, one thing we want to take into account is the age. Now, here is the size of fully grown, older, adult-sized dinosaurs. But it'd actually be logical that Noah would not bring fully mature animals and such into the ark, but he would bring younger animals because they're meant to multiply. And many dinosaurs grow throughout much of their lives. There are lizards and chameleons and things today that just grow their entire lives. So it's much more likely that Noah would bring in smaller, younger dinosaurs, and they would not be so gigantic as ones we have seen. They'd be big, but they would not be as gigantic as people have depicted them to be. So it's quite doable. Here we see in Genesis 6:14-16, the instructions. So make yourself an ark of cypress wood. Make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. This is how you are to build it. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. Make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening of 1 cubit high all around. Put a door in the side of the ark and make the lower, middle, and upper decks. So a cubit was the tip of the fingers to the elbow. So that could be about 18 inches or so. There's different estimations, but most people say that Noah's Ark was about 450 feet long, which would be 150 meters, 75 feet wide, about 25 meters, and 45 feet high, about 15 meters. So as opposed to those children's books, actually Noah's Ark looked more like this. And look at the lower part of that picture. You can see how big the elephants and even the dinosaurs would have been in comparison to the size of the ark. So it was actually quite doable. All the needed animals could fit into the ark. There was space in the ark equal to about 520 railway boxcars. So that's a big amount of space. Here's a scale model of the ark called Johan's Ark, as that's the name of the guy who built it in Dordrecht, Netherlands. So you can see the size of this thing. And you can go there and tour it. There also is the Ark Encounter in Williamsburg, Kentucky, USA, also built by scale to the ark.
Thank you. In just a couple of hours, the replica of Noah's Ark in northern Kentucky will actually be open to visitors.
Yeah, owners of the Ark Encounter at the Creation Museum say this could draw more than 1 million people each year, but it is not without controversy. Jordan Burgess is live with what to expect on this opening day. Jordan.
Right now, some last-minute preparations going on here at the Ark Encounter in Williamstown to get it ready for opening day. It will open in a short time. You can see how it towers over the landscape here. The question, the thing that we'll be watching is, will the crowds be just as sizable? Now, one thing that is for sure is that the controversies have come 2 by 2 at times for this place. Now, we got a first-hand look at the Ark Encounter earlier this week. Now, the Ark was built to match the one written about in the biblical story of Noah and the flood. Now, the builders, Answers in Genesis, believe the Ark could attract more than 2 million visitors a year and generate billions in revenue and thousands of jobs over the next decade. But some are critical of an $18 million tax incentive the project is getting from Kentucky. Basically, it's a rebate on some of the tax dollars brought in by the project. It was challenged in court, but a judge ruled in the Ark's favor. Still, some protesters say that they will be out here today, maybe about 100 people or so, protesting the fact that they say the Ark is anti-science and that they are
now
critical of the hiring practices here, that they hire only Christians.
Flood,
now, the place is
because,
expected
of course,
to open
according
at
to
9 a.m. this morning here to the public
Bible story
for
of
the
Noah's
first
Ark,
time,
there
and
was
that will be
a
the start
flood
of
that
40
covered the
days and 40
entire
nights. That's right,
world.
just like in the Bible.
And here we can see some different points for that. That it was a flood that covered the whole world, not just a local flood. Number one, there were many people in the world. So you would need a worldwide flood to wipe everyone out. The flood was about approximately, by the biblical timeline, about 1,700 years after creation, looking at the genealogies and so on. And the average lifespan before the flood was about 900 years. And Adam and Eve, according to Josephus, the historian, had 33 sons and 22 daughters. Think about it. If you lived 900 years, the number of children one could have. And even in our present shorter lifespan, people have been able to have many children. Benjamin Franklin was the 15th out of 19 children. There's a woman named Leontina Judith Albina Espinoza from Chile who had 58 children in her lifetime. A number of them were twins and triplets, but still, that a person could have that many children in a short lifetime is quite interesting. And so if the average family before the flood had about 20 children, that's less than half of what Adam and Eve had, according to Josephus. In 10 generations up to the flood, the world population would have been about 2 billion. So you could have had a lot of people, and they couldn't just be in one local area. They would have had to have fanned out into the world. And we know that even in the time of Cain, there was a large population. In Genesis 4:13-14, Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than what I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." So he sounds like, who knows who I'll meet. There's a lot of people out there. Genesis 4:17, Cain made love to his wife, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Enoch. Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch. So, people were multiplying so much, even during the life of Cain, that he was building a city. So number 2, a second argument for the worldwide flood. If the flood was local, why didn't Noah just move? There are some people even today who argue, some on the liberal end, such as Hugh Ross and others, who argue that the flood was local. And if it was, it would make no sense to make this gigantic ship and get all the animals and all this effort. So it was a worldwide flood. Number 3, the highest mountains were covered. So if it was some local little flood, it would not cover the highest mountains. That shows it was a global flood. Genesis 7:20 says the waters rose and covered the mountains to a depth of more than 15 cubits. That's 20 feet. Number 4, the ground did not dry up for a year. I mean, if it was a little local flood, the ground would have dried up much quicker. I've spent time in India, and most years there's flooding in certain parts of India, down in Kerala and up in Bihar and other areas like that. And the flooding is pretty bad, but still, just a few months later, the whole thing is dried up. It doesn't last for a year. In fact, often the same year, there'll be a drought in the very same places where there was massive amounts of rain. So the fact the ground did not dry up for a year show it was a global flood. Number 5, the Bible was clear that the flood would kill all people, not just people in one region. Genesis 7:21-23, every living thing that moved on land perished. Birds, livestock, wild animals, all the creatures that swarm over the earth, and all mankind. Everything on dry land that had breath of life in its nostrils died. Every living thing on the earth, on the face of the earth, was wiped out. People and animals and creatures that move along the ground and the birds were wiped out from the earth. Only Noah was left and those with him in the ark. Genesis 7:21-23. Number 6, the New Testament is also clear. It was worldwide. In Luke 17:26-27, just as it was in the days of Noah, so also it will be in the days of the Son of Man. People were eating, drinking, marrying, and being given into marriage up to the day Noah entered the ark. Then the flood came and destroyed them all. So even Jesus said they were all destroyed. 2 Peter 3:6, by these waters also the world at that time was deluged and destroyed, right? It says the world, not just one region. Number 7, there are flood stories from all over the world. If you look at ancient peoples of different areas around the world, many, many ancient peoples had flood stories. In fact, almost all peoples of the earth have an ancient flood story. There are at least 270 ancient flood stories from all over the place. The Eskimos of North America, the Siberian peoples, Finland, Maori of New Zealand, Australian Aborigines, Greeks, Lithuanians, Wales, Southeast Asia, India, Iceland, Iran, Wales, the Romans, Indonesia, Hawaii, Incas of South America, and so on. In Hawaii, for example, they have a story that there was a one good man on the earth left. Everyone else was wicked. His name was Nu'u. And he made a great canoe with a house on it and filled it with animals. The waters came up all over the earth and killed all the people. Only Nu'u and his wife, or his family, were saved. And the Chinese have the ancient story of Fuhi, that Fuhi, his wife, 3 sons and 3 daughters escaped in the Great Flood. He and his family were the only people alive on the earth, and after a great flood, they repopulated the world. And the Babylonians had an account of a great flood. And the ancient Hindu scriptures mention someone named Manu. There lived in ancient time a holy man called Manu, who by penances and prayers had won the favor of the Lord of heaven. Manu was said to have had 3 sons before the flood. Vishnu told him of a flood and instructed Manu to build a boat and fill it with animals and seeds to repopulate the earth. Manu's boat was described as being perched on the top of the Malabar range of mountains. When the waters had subsided, Manu repopulated the earth, and all human beings could trace their ancestry to either one of those flood survivors. And the Greeks had a flood story, that Zeus sent a great flood, and Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha, after floating in a chest for 9 days and nights, landed on Parnassus, a mountain there, and when the rain ceased, he sacrificed to Zeus. The Toltec Indians of ancient Mexico had this story. The first world lasted 1,716 years and was destroyed by a great flood that covered the highest mountains. Only one family named Coxcox survived. So there's many different flood stories that cultures have. It's interesting that timeline of 1,700 years fits the genealogies in the Bible, and also fits this, that you look at different trees. For example, the oldest trees we have in the world are bristlecone pines. They're dated to be about 3,000 to 5,000 years old. Or sequoias. The oldest sequoia is called President, a tree in Sequoia National Park, 3,200 years old. Now, these types of trees don't die of old age. They just keep growing and growing and growing. So why don't we have trees that are 7,000 years old, or 10,000 years old, or 20,000 years old, or 30,000 years old? Why are they only as young as they are? Because of the Great Flood, because there was no trees that survived. Seeds, on the other hand, can survive. In fact, I'm sure you've heard stories about how they have found seeds in the pyramids of Egypt that were thousands of years old, planted them, and they grew into plants. So the earth could have been completely refilled with plants and trees and everything from the seeds that took root after the flood. Here's even an old ancient coin that depicted the flood, a coin minted in Phrygia and Pella. There you see Philip I on one side and Noah's Ark on the other. And you can see in another picture of this coin, the name Noah inscribed on the side of the ark as they depict it. And you can see the dove there with the olive branch. An eighth evidence for the worldwide flood is marine fossils, even on mountains. There's Mount Everest, the highest mountain in the world. And when Sir Edmund Hillary first climbed Mount Everest in 1953, he was going up there with Tenzing Norgay. And when he hit the 26,000-foot level, he struck his pick into the grounds to pick himself up when he noticed seashells. From the 26,000 feet level all the way up to the top at 29,000 feet, the entire top of that mountain is sedentary rock packed full of seashells. Another interesting thing is to note the seashells were petrified in a closed position. When a clam dies, he opens, showing it they were fossilized very quickly while alive. There is enough water on the Earth so that if the surface of the Earth was perfectly smooth, the water would cover the Earth 1.5 miles or 2.5 kilometers high. Number 9, sedimentary rock and graveyard fossils worldwide. It would take a huge flood and a lot of things to make these fossils. 75% of the Earth's crust is sedimentary rock laid down by water. So something big happened to lay down all this rock in that way. And we have fossil graveyards where there are bones of animals, of all sorts of different kinds of animals, all together, as if they all kind of were in one place. You know, you can imagine the flood coming up and the animals are rushing up the mountain to get away from the flood, and all sorts of different animals that didn't typically hang out together would be cramped in certain areas trying to escape the flood. So this is evidence of some huge catastrophe. Number 10, coal beds and oil deposits. This is Eagle Butte Mine in Wyoming. Strip mines have coal seams up to 200 feet, that's 60 meters thick. It takes 3 meters of vegetation to make 1 foot of coal. So these 200-foot seams would have required 1,800 feet or 600 meters of vegetation, quickly covered over by mud, to form. So there would have to be a huge disaster to make this possible, and a huge amount of vegetation. This 30-foot petrified tree is one of the hundreds found in the Kettles coal mines near Cookeville, Tennessee. The top and the bottom are in different coal seams, dated thousands of years different in age, according to the evolutionary timeline. Here's an article about how much vegetation it would take to form these things. Bad mileage, 98 tons of plants per gallon. A staggering 98 tons, now a ton is like 2,000 pounds or 1,000 kg. A staggering 98 tons of prehistoric buried plant material, that's 196,000 pounds, is required to produce each gallon of gasoline we burn in our cars, SUVs, trucks, and other vehicles, according to a study conducted at the University of Utah. Can you imagine loading 40 acres worth of wheat, stalks, roots, and all into the tank of your car or SUV every 20 miles? Asked ecologist Jeff Dukes, whose study will be published in the November issue of the Journal of Climatic Change. And so if we have these oil fields full of oil, thousands of gallons of oil, some of these oil fields, they've been pumping out oil for decades, and each gallon required so much plant life to make it even possible. You can imagine the amount of catastrophe that was required to create these oil fields in the first place. Here's a cast iron pot found in a coal seam in 1912 at the Municipal Electric Plant in Thomas, Oklahoma, USA. So you have this cast iron pot found inside coal. Now, according to evolution, these people who believe that the earth is very, very old, these coal seams are hundreds of thousands of years old and so on. But yet we have a iron pot found in some coal, showing that the earth is younger than they think. And the coal was actually created about 4,300 years ago in the Great Flood. In 1944, Newton Anderson in West Virginia found this bell inside a lump of coal in 1944. This coal is supposedly 300 million years old, so that doesn't make sense. In June 1851, Scientific American reprinted a report that first appeared in the Boston Transcript about a metallic vase that had been discovered by miners. The vase was found in two parts among rubble that had been dynamited out of solid sedimentary rock in Massachusetts. Okay, now we'll look at the pre-flood atmosphere, because the atmosphere was different before the flood. Psalms 136:6 says, "To him that stretched out the earth above the waters." So there was water underneath the earth, in addition to a canopy of overhead water or ice. Here's a diagram of it. It's believed that there was a few feet of ice suspended by the Meissner effect above 20 kilometers of air. And then you had below the earth 1 kilometer of water under the crust, where the fountains of the deep came from, mentioned in Genesis 7. Look at Genesis 1:7. And that is what happened. God made this space to separate the waters of the earth from the waters of the heavens. So there it seems to be talking about waters underneath the earth and waters above. Psalms 24:1, "To him that stretched out the earth above the waters." So talking about waters underneath the earth. In Genesis chapter 2, 5-6, it talks about waters coming up from underneath. Now no shrub had yet appeared on the earth, and no plant had yet sprung up, for the Lord God had not sent rain on the earth, and there was no one to work the ground. But streams came up from the earth and watered the whole surface of the ground. So it's believed by creation scientists that there was a canopy around the earth, an atmosphere protected by a layer of ice, and ice can be up in the atmosphere. It can float up there. For example, if you recall the U.S. Space Shuttle, ice clouds were actually formed from the Space Shuttle's exhaust, and these clouds drifted towards the poles and floated there in the cold minus 220 degrees Fahrenheit air, which was about 51 miles or 85 kilometers above the Arctic, so that ice particles were actually able to float up there, showing we could have a sort of ice canopy in our atmosphere. And Josephus, the Jewish historian, talked about this. He wrote in his book, "After this, on the second day, he placed the heaven over the whole world, and separated it from the other parts and determined it should stand by itself, he also placed a crystalline firmament round it. So in other words, we had this ice atmosphere protecting the Earth, and this provided what we call a greenhouse effect. And that is when the warm air comes in but is not able to escape, and so you have a nice warm tropical atmosphere. It results when large amounts of carbon dioxide and other gases trap heat near the surface of the Earth. And so the pre-flood world was more tropical and probably loaded with bigger trees and animals from pole to pole. It's also believed that the atmosphere before the flood had probably about double the amount of air pressure. Under double atmospheric pressure, blood plasma will become more oxygen saturated. So the oxygen gets more into your bloodstream, gives you more energy, more health. Back in 1987, there was baby Jessica in the USA, baby Jessica McClure, and she fell into a small 8-inch or 20-centimeter well, a deep well, and was trapped down there for 58 and a half hours. And there was a huge nationally televised rescue effort to rescue her out of this little narrow well. Finally, after 58 and a half hours, they did rescue her. But baby Jessica McClure had lost circulation to some parts of her body for that time. So what they did is they put her into a hyperbaric oxygen chamber. And this provided higher pressure to get the oxygen into her system and bring quicker healing. And there's a picture of her after 1 year, and she pretty much was completely healed through this oxygen chamber. So these hyperbaric oxygen chambers are used for various injuries and conditions to really help people heal quicker. They use them a lot in sports, for example, and sometimes used to treat autism or neurological disorders. Also, this early atmosphere was said to have about 50% more oxygen. From Time magazine, they had an analysis which said 50% more oxygen than it has now, talking about the atmosphere. Here's another scientific article. The only trend in recent literature is a suggestion of far more oxygen in the early atmosphere than anyone imagined. And you really do feel better if you're able to breathe pure oxygen. That's why they've had some popularity with those oxygen bars where people can just go in and breathe in that pure oxygen and get energized. And also as people get older and some in various medical conditions, they use pure oxygen to really get that into their system. So this ice canopy over the atmosphere also would have blocked out harmful radiation. Radiation is what ages us. We slowly decay from it. There was a scientist, Dr. Kei Mori at Keio University in Tokyo, who raised tomato plants under a plastic greenhouse that filtered out ultraviolet light, in other words, the radiation. He also pressurized carbon dioxide to the stems of the plants. And what he ended up with was a tomato plant that could grow about 10,000 tomatoes once out of the harmful rays. So X-rays, for example, go through your body like bullets from a machine gun. It's just radiation being blasted at you, and that's what the sun does. The sun gives us life, but at the same time, the sun X-rays us every day of our lives, except on cloudy days, in a sense, giving us that radiation. So before the flood, we had this atmosphere with this vapor ice canopy that let in the natural light, but the harmful UV light, ultraviolet light with the radiation, was being blocked. So to sum up, because our Earth and atmosphere before the flood was tropical, had 50% more oxygen, had higher air pressure, had very little radiation, and was watered by these springs, people and animals could live longer, and some grew to be much larger than is the case now. This is why dinosaurs could, and large dinosaurs could thrive before the flood. Here's a dragonfly. We had quite a few of these in my home state of Minnesota, and that's about the typical size of a dragonfly. But they have found dragonfly fossils with a wingspan, for example, of 15 centimeters. So in the old days, you would have dragonflies perhaps this big. Or you could have something like the baboon about this size compared to a man. Or they have found evidence that there were something like alligators or crocodiles about this size compared to a man. Or can you imagine running into an ostrich about this size? And so birds and various creatures were larger than what they are today. Cockroaches over 18 inches, that's 45 centimeters, have been found in the fossil record. So that would be more of a challenge if we had those. In 1999, a centipede 8.5 feet long, 2.8 meters, was found by paleontologists in Germany. There's a picture of a modern-day larger snake, but there's been evidence, for example, the Smithsonian has this model of how big snakes could have been in ancient times. They called it the monster snake. Here's someone holding an armadillo. That's a creature that's quite common in places like Texas, USA. But they know that there were ancient armadillos that were as big as a car. And they have found evidence of grasshoppers that were over 2 feet long, 60 centimeters. Here's a man holding a beaver. That's the typical size of one. But here are the bones of one displayed in Uruguay. And here are some oysters. That's the typical size of oysters. But here are some giant oysters. More than 500 fossilized giant oysters were found nearly 2 miles above sea level in the Andes Mountains of Peru. The discovery of the oysters, some which are 11.5 feet wide and weigh 660 pounds, reinforced the scientific theory that 200 million years ago, the Andes Mountains were covered by the sea. Now, of course, they say 200 million years ago. I say 4,300 years ago. But even the secular scientists agree that the mountains were covered at one point by the sea. And in 2002, scientists in Australia found ancient fossils of a goose that stood as high as an elephant and weighed as much as 1,000 pounds, 400 kg. Peter Murray of the Museum of Central Australia in Alice Springs said they were big and agile and had nasty beaks. Some of the big ones could have easily sheared your hand off with a bite. So maybe it's because these geese used to be so large that they still can be overconfident and quite aggressive even today.
Passou!
And here's another big creature, a giant sea turtle, still on display at Yale Museum in New Haven, Connecticut. And here's a drawing of an 11-foot 6-inch or 3.5 meter man from an Italian coal mine. So there were bigger people as well, and the Bible does mention giants in the land before the flood. Also, this atmosphere that used to exist before the flood allowed people to live much longer without all that radiation coming in and so on. So if you look at this chart, you can see that people generally lived to be around 900 years, right? You can see Adam lived, I believe, 930 years, and Seth lived 912 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. He died just before the flood. In fact, some people have said that that name Methuselah means when he dies, judgment. But then you notice after the flood, the lifespan of people got less. You see, for example, Shem living 600 years. And then you see the lives of people go down to 500, 400, 300, 200. Abraham lived 175 years. So you can see after the flood, the lifespan of people went down and down to about what it tends to be today. So what caused the collapse of this pre-flood atmosphere and the flood? It's believed to be some sort of a meteorite or asteroid that hit the Earth and collapsed this atmosphere. And very large meteorites or asteroids have struck the Earth and other planets in the past and could strike us again.
Our solar system is full of deadly missiles that could strike at any time.
It's like cosmic roulette. You can't go on playing a game of chance and expect to keep winning.
Killer asteroids. Trillions of tons of rock, hurtling through space at tens of thousands of miles per hour. Some are on a collision course with Earth.
An asteroid has more damage potential than a nuclear bomb of the same energy.
65
And there's evidence of big meteor strikes that have happened on the Earth and other planets. Here are some on Earth. The biggest visible one that's clearly visible is the Barringer crater in Winslow, Arizona. And then there is the Wolf Creek crater, which is in Australia. And the Lonar crater near Aurangabad, India. I hope to visit that one someday. It's now a lake that has formed in the crater. And in 1908, there was something called the Tunguska event. And that is when a meteor hit the middle of Siberia, and it was large enough to where it did a great deal of damage. In fact, it wiped out these trees you can see in these photos. So the Tunguska event happened on June 30th, 1908. It was so powerful, nomads were hurled from their tents 25 miles away. It flattened trees for 50 kilometers around. A farmer 65 kilometers away felt like his shirt was burning, and then he was thrown to the ground. Horses were knocked to the ground even 640 kilometers away. An explosion was heard for nearly 1,000 miles away. And that night in Europe, newspapers could be read at midnight from the fallout of it. The night sky glowed in Europe and parts of Asia for days. And there is what they say is the site of where this meteor came down. And even in recent times, we've seen meteorites and that sort of thing. The Chelyabinsk event happened on February 15th, 2013, also in the Siberia area of Russia. And even though this meteor was only about the size, I believe, of a couple vans or something like that, the shock waves of it was pretty powerful. And there you can see that's where they say it landed. Here's some video of when that happened.
Нихуя себе, это что такое? О, нихуя метеорит, блядь.
Внимание,
Ебануться.
Я сейчас подойду, подожди. Нихуя себе.
So we know that meteorites and asteroids have hit the Earth and other planets in the past. Look at the moon. I mean, just if you look at the moon with a telescope, you can see this, or even with binoculars, you can see it's just full of craters. It's just been pelted by all sorts of things. So we know that, over in the past, a lot of things were flying around and hitting. Mars as well has a number of craters. And Mercury is also peppered with craters. So some stuff has gone on in the past. Well, it's believed that a good possibility for this event was a planet that got too close to Earth. And there is something called Roches limit, meaning that when two planets get to a certain distance from each other, the smaller one will just blow up. It'll just break up. And that's what they believe happened. And then pieces of that planet, or possibly a moon that had broken away from a larger planet, pieces of that hit the Earth enough to collapse the atmospheric canopy over the Earth. And here you can see a diagram showing where the planets are in our solar system. And if you look at the next picture, that shows the actual distances of the planets from the sun. And there's something called the Titus-Bode law, which was come up by mathematicians who figured out that as you go out from the sun, the ratio of each planet in its distance from the sun increases at a certain ratio to the previous planet's distance to the sun. And according to those calculations, there should have been a planet that was between Mars and Jupiter. But there isn't one. But there is the asteroid belt there. And so what many believe is that the asteroid belt is not some planet in formation like some evolutionists have suggested, because they think things are getting better and better, but rather it was a planet that blew up. And these are all fragments of the planet. And if that happened and some of these bigger fragments hit the Earth, that could collapse the canopy of the Earth. And some have named that planet Electra. In fact, there's even a Greek legend about Electra being one of the gods and who was lost, and that this planet, which was a god, was lost. So who knows? Also, what hit the Earth could have had ice, and this ice, when this planet hit the Earth, could have collected among the poles, which would explain the sudden freezing of the poles. Another explanation for the sudden freezing of the poles with ice would be the fountains of the deep. Genesis 7:11-12 says, and it's describing the flood, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the second month, on that day all the springs of the great deep burst forth, and the floodgates of the heavens were opened, and the rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. So a lot of this rain could actually be water that had shot out from the earth, from the fountains of the deep. And that would explain where all the water came from. And this water could have instantly frozen at the poles. And this is why they have found mastodons up in the area of Siberia, Alaska, and so on, which were instantly frozen. I mean, they have found them with like tropical plants in their stomachs or in the process of eating tropical plants. So they were instantly frozen, and this could have happened that way. So now we'll talk about Mount Ararat. This is where it's said Noah's Ark still rests, in an area called the Ahura Gorge at about the 13,000 to 15,000 foot level. And Mount Ararat is in Armenia. And here's a picture of Little Ararat and Big Ararat. So the Ark site is said to be on Big Ararat. So they're huge mountains that dominate the landscape. And we don't want to be confused by the false Ark site. There was a man named Wyatt who lived up until 1999, and he promoted what I would say is a false Ark site. He claimed that Noah's Ark was not on Mount Ararat, but it was about 15 miles away. They called it the Wyat-Fasold site because a Wyatt and another guy named Fasold promoted it. And there's a picture of it, and you can see it close up there. But people have examined this site, and what they found is that though there's a little ship-like shape to it, it's actually just a geological formation on which was built a Mughal fort. It's just rock. There's not a wooden boat there or anything like that. But this has distracted many people, maybe because it's more accessible, but you can actually go there as opposed to the, climbing up Mount Ararat is very difficult. But anyone can go to this site and take pictures of it. And so it's quite a distraction. In fact, if you go on Google and do an image search on Noah's Ark site, you'll pull up a bunch of photos of this false Ark site. It's a complete distraction. Now, again, maybe because they can actually take pictures of this thing where there's no big pictures of Noah's Ark clearly there on Mount Ararat. So it's a distraction. This guy, Ron Wyatt, who promoted this site, he was a person who looked for different biblical sites, but he had a lot of discovery claims that are questionable, a bit too wild. He claimed to find the true site of the crucifixion. He claimed that he found the Ark of the Covenant under this true site. So what he said was that when Jesus died on the cross, his blood went to the ground and dripped on the mercy seat of the Ark. A very good sounding story, but he's the only one who ever saw this thing. 3, he said he found the true site of the Red Sea crossing with a marker built by King Solomon as a memorial. He said he found the actual site where the Hebrews crossed the Red Sea, and that he found the chariot wheels from Pharaoh's drowned army, and he had some fuzzy video to prove it, but no actual evidence. He said he found the actual rock that Moses struck to release water, that he found Noah's grave, that he found Noah's house with inscriptions about the flood, that he found Noah's wife's grave with $75 million worth of gold, which was stolen by another. So he says he found these things, but the evidence was never really produced. So it's looking more and more that Ron Wyatt was a person with quite a wild imagination. Some of the people who worked with him actually distanced themselves from him because of his exaggerations. And then David Fasold, who was the other person promoting this alternative Ark site, at first when he promoted, he had not been there so much. He just kind of sent funds and helped people to go there. Once he really was able to spend time there and examine the area and look around, he said, "I believe this may be the oldest running hoax in history. I think we have found what the ancients said was the ark, but this structure is not Noah's Ark." And so that's from David Fasold, who the site is partially named after. So don't be distracted. Noah's Ark did not land 15 miles away from Mount Ararat, but on Mount Ararat itself. Another factor is that after the ark landed, some time went by, and then mountaintops became visible. And so the ark couldn't land at this low point because there were mountains well above it. That doesn't make sense. So the ark is believed to be located in an area called the Ahura Gorge. That's the area that's kind of that big gouge there in Big Ararat. And that was from the earthquake in the 1800s. And that's where the sightings have been of Noah's Ark. A number of ancient towns near Mount Ararat had names that coincided with the flood story. Like Nakchivan, what actually meant the first place of lodging. Teneman meant the place of the 8. There were 8 people in the ark. Saran, the place of dispersion. Sharnik, the village of Noah. Tabriz, which means the ship. Aharn, which means the planting of the vine. Remember, Noah planted a vine after the flood. The Turks call Mount Ararat Agrida, which means mountain of the ark. The Persians or the Iranians call Mount Ararat Koki Noah, the mountain of Noah. So there's a map showing where Mount Ararat is, and it's right on the eastern end of Turkey. Now there's a clearer map. One difficulty about people wanting to climb Mount Ararat is that it is on a very sensitive border zone between Turkey and Armenia and Georgia and Azerbaijan and Iran. It's like extremely crazy location, and so there's a lot of fear of terrorism and spying and so on. So a lot of time permission's not even given for people to go up on the mountain. And there are many challenges to climbing Mount Ararat. This is the reason we haven't had as many people go up as you would think, because a lot of people say, well, if Noah's Ark is up there, why don't you all just go up there and find it and take pictures of it? And, well, it's not quite that easy. Mount Ararat is the tallest mountain in the world. Not the highest. The highest is Mount Everest. But the tallest as far as from its base to its peak. And so it involves a lot of climbing. At the base of Mount Ararat, it's very hot. At the peak, very cold. There is less acclimatization. In other words, because people are starting at a low elevation at the bottom of Mount Ararat, in comparison to the top, there's less time for acclimatization, and mountain sickness can happen at higher elevations. I went on a trek in Nepal, the Annapurna Circuit, and we took time to acclimatize. We spent time, in Pokhara, which is at the fairly high elevation, and then as we went up on the trek, we stopped in some towns to spend time to acclimatize before we went over the high pass, which I believe was about 17,000 feet. So finally, when we did go over the pass, and we took anti-climate sickness pills, but even with that, we really felt it. I mean, you would take 20 steps up the hill and you just stop and rest and pant, and you'd look back and everyone else would just be standing there, catching their breath. So just the thin air alone can be quite a challenge. Extreme heat at the bottom. They say the bottom of Mount Ararat is so hot that you could sometimes fry an egg on the ground. Mosquitoes and scorpions at the bottom. Man attacking wolf dogs, bears. Porous rock and no trees. If you look at the mountain, there's not trees once you begin to go up it. So there's no water available. You have to carry all, I've been trekking up in the mountains of Nepal, like I said, and, we could find water up there if need be. There were streams and things coming down. But if you're going up Mount Ararat, you wouldn't find that because the rock is porous and the snow melts and it just goes straight into the ground. So you have to carry all that water with you. Volcanic rocks, they say it's like climbing a pile of bowling balls. It's very difficult to climb up the mountain and you slip around quite a bit. Some people say you go up 3 steps and slide down 2. Storms every day on Mount Ararat with lightning strikes. A number of climbers have been struck by lightning. Fast rolling boulders, and often in fog, so people don't even see them coming. A number of people have gotten injured, don't even remember being hit. Dangerous cliffs and unseen crevices and glaciers. Extreme cold at higher elevations. The guides are superstitious, and so sometimes they'll abandon the climbers midway. There are armed bandits up there, and there's snow and ice. And usually the ark is under snow and ice, so they may even get up to the very site where the ark would be, and they wouldn't be able to see the ark because it's buried under ice and snow. So a lot of challenges are there. There's a man named John Levy from San Francisco, USA, who really got it into his heart to try to climb Mount Ararat and find the Ark. And you can see all the obstacles he ran into. Early in 1954, he made his first attempt. He was chased by 2 bears, wiped out by the chase, and got all cold and sweaty and had to give up the climb. Later in 1954, he tried again. The weather turned out bad, so climbing became impossible. Then in 1958, with 40 men, he went up but then fell off a 30-foot cliff and was hospitalized. 1960, he had caught pneumonia on the climb and he was hospitalized. In 1962, when in Italy on his way to Ararat, he was robbed of all expedition finances. 1965, he was with a group of 10 people. They separated into 3 groups in a big storm or blizzard, and one group was wiped out by exposure as they were lost, and all the food was washed away. In 1967, he said it was the worst ever snow and extreme cold, and one climber died when he fell off a cliff. In 1969, at 73 years old, he got to the spot where he believed the Ark to be, found some sea fossils, but no Ark. And as I said, usually it's buried under ice and snow. Former astronaut James Irwin tried to climb Mount Ararat to find the Ark, but was hit by a boulder, nearly killed, and had to be taken off the mountain and hospitalized. You may have heard that show Baywatch that they had in USA, and one woman who starred in it was Donna D'Errico, who is a Christian, who got it into her mind to try to find Noah's Ark. And so she did organize an expedition to go up Mount Ararat, but unfortunately she slipped at one point on some of that crumbly rock, nearly fell off a cliff, except someone grabbed her and saved her life, but she was a bit scratched up and went on the internet and posted a video blog about her experience. But the problem is that video blog went all over because she was a movie star or a TV star. And so then it became known in the news that she was on Mount Ararat, and she had to cancel the rest of her climb because if these armed bandits knew that a celebrity was up on Mount Ararat, they could have tried to hold her hostage for money. And so she had to cancel that climb.
That Baywatch star is now searching for Noah's Ark. Actress Donna D'Errico starred on the show for 3 years, but now she says she has Ark fever, and that's why she set out to climb Mount Ararat. ABC's Nick Watt has her story.
Looking for Noah's Ark.
I know it sounds ludicrous, and I know that most people out there don't think that Noah's Ark ever really happened, but that's not how it is for me. I'm looking for something that is there, and this is my lifelong dream.
The Bible tells us Noah's Ark came to ground here in what are now the Badlands of eastern Turkey, roamed by rebels.
I know I look terrible, but there's no mirrors and there's no makeup and there's no hairbrushes or anything when you're on Mount Ararat.
Now, Donna says she rediscovered her faith after divorcing Nikki Sixx of Motley Crue fame. Then in 2010, she suffered a near-fatal MRSA infection.
I said to myself, you know, I almost died and I haven't accomplished my dream yet.
Here's the view from inside my tent.
That dream to search for Noah's Ark nearly killed her, 11,000 feet up.
I stepped on a rock that wasn't secure, and I was bopping around on my face with all the rocks under me and headed towards the edge of a cliff.
Her climbing partner grabbed her backpack.
He prevented me from going over the edge. My feet were dangling. I mean, I would have been a goner.
Snapshots of her injuries hit the internet. Would the local rebels now realize who she was? Donna had to get off that mountain.
I don't especially think that they're violent or that they would, you know, kill us, but kidnapping us maybe, you know. And
but you're still going to go back?
Yeah, I'm going to go back.
She's already
I haven't cleaned
packing.
everything yet, but
You're going back very soon, and that's concerning.
The other thing that slightly concerns me about this story selfishly is that this is going to reinforce this idea that all of us who live here in Los Angeles are nuts.
maybe it's the blonde hair, though. Maybe you're off the hook because you're not a blonde woman.
Here's a map of the top portion of Mount Ararat with the Ahora Gorge. And there's the Ahora Gorge on the left side there. And that's where it's believed Noah's Ark is. That is where the sightings have occurred over many years. So we're going to talk about the sightings of Noah's Ark as we look back in history. In 700 BC, pilgrims scraped tar off the ark for good luck omens. In 300 BC, Berosus, the Babylonian high priest, said remains could still be seen and tar was still collected there. In 30 BC, Nicholas of Damascus, the biographer of Herod the Great, said the relics of timbers were still on Mount Ararat. In 80 AD, Josephus, a famous Jewish historian, Bible scholars use his works, he said its remains are shown there by inhabitants to this day. In 100 AD, Theophilus, the bishop of Antioch, said that the remains could still be seen of the ark. John Chrysostom, Archbishop of Constantinople, 347 to 407 AD, said, "Have you heard of the flood, that universal destruction? Do not the mountains of Ararat testify to it, where the ark rested? Are not the remains of the ark preserved there to this very day for our admonition?" Archbishop Isidore of Seville, he said, "Ararat is a mountain in Armenia where historians testify that the ark came to rest after the flood. So even to this day, wood remains of it are to be seen there." Marco Polo, that famous explorer around 1300, said, "In the heart of the Armenian mountain range, the mountain's peak is shaped like a cube or cup on which Noah's Ark is said to have rested, whence it is called the Mountain of Noah's Ark." 1829, a Russian physician, Frederick Perrot, climbed Mount Ararat, and he saw some timbers at high altitude, well above the tree line. He also saw artifacts at a monastery in Ahora village. That monastery was later destroyed in an earthquake, the same one that created the Ahora Gorge. Then there was this man named Hajji Yearam. He lived from 1838 to 1920. And he said that around 1856, maybe when he was about 18 years old or so, he helped lead some scientists to the ark. And his story was that when he was younger, some scientists came and said they wanted to go up to see the Ark. And they pretended they were quite interested to see the Ark. But it turned out they hired him and his father, and they led them up, and they got to the Ark. But it turned out these scientists were actually atheists, and they just wanted to disprove the whole thing. And when these scientists saw that the Ark was really there, they flew into a rage. And they tried to wreck the Ark, but they couldn't do a thing to it. Petrified wood. They wanted to burn it and so on, but couldn't do a thing. And so the scientists took a death oath, and they decided none of them would tell of this discovery. And they said if any of the other people told of the discovery, like any of the other scientists, that the other two would find that person and torture them and kill them. And they told Hajji and his father that they better say nothing or they would kill them as well. So Hajji did not talk about this for a long time. But Hajji became a businessman and eventually moved to America, but later was in bad health and was taken care of by the Williams family. And the boy of the Williams family was this guy named Harold Williams, who became a pastor, and he heard Hajji Yearam tell this story. And Hajji Yearam, like I said, died around 1920. And around the time Hajji Yearam died, I think a little bit after, Harold Williams was looking at the newspaper, and he found an obituary, a little article, obituary, and it talked about some famous scientist that had just died. But before the scientist died, he made a confession that he had seen Noah's Ark. So he believed that that scientist was one of the ones on that expedition. Then there was this man named Prince John Joseph Nori, who found the Ark on April 25th, 1887. And Prince Nori was a very colorful character. Here is his full name and title in one account. His Pontifical Eminence, the Most Venerable Prelate, Monsignor the Zamorin Nori, John Joseph Prince Nori, D.D. LLD, by divine providence, Chaldean Patriarchal Archdeacon of Babylon and Jerusalem, Grand Apostolic Ambassador of Malabar, India and Persia, the discoverer of Noah's Ark, and the Golden Mountains of the Moon, soon to be coronated as the Patriarch of the Chaldean Nestorian Church. He also is sometimes called the Sacred Crown Supreme Representative General of the Holy Orthodox Patriarchal Imperiality, and the first universal exploring traveler of 1,000,000 miles. He is said to have spoken in 10 languages, so quite a colorful character, but he was a real person, and he had said that he had climbed Mount Ararat 3 times and found the Ark on the 3rd climb. And he said the bow and the stern were in view, but the center was buried in snow, and on one end had fallen off and decayed. It stood more than 100 feet high and over 300 yards long. He only saw it from a distance and could not reach it. The wood was peculiar, dark reddish in color, almost iron-colored, in fact, and very thick. I think the cold has preserved the wood. I am very positive we saw the real Ark, though it's over 4,000 years old. And he actually at that time tried to obtain finances to bring it to the 1893 World's Fair in Chicago, but was not able. And then this newspaper article about him appears in the San Francisco Call in 19th April 1897. And it says here, John Joseph Nori crowned, the learned Oriental known here and of Washington was not an impostor. Washington, D.C., April 18th. A strange-looking man came here several years ago, introducing himself as John Joseph Nori, Archdeacon of Babylon. He wore the garb of a monk, and this, with his Oriental features, made him contemplative object on the streets. Among other things, he said he had discovered the remains of Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat. This met with a denial from the Turkish minister, but Reverend Dr. Easton, a Presbyterian clergyman who had met the man in San Francisco, had faith in his claims and invited him to become his guest. The local presbytery undertook to find out whether the man was an impostor, but he showed he was well versed in the doctrines of the Greek Church. Another test imposed was a translation of hieroglyphic tablets in the Smithsonian Institution. He performed the task so well that he proved himself to be an able Oriental scholar. People began to think of him as mildly insane, and he was persuaded to start for Baghdad. He stopped in London and figured prominently in the newspapers through an attempt to secure the protection of the British government on the ground he was one of Her Majesty's subjects and heir to the patriarchal throne at Trichy, India. A letter just received by Dr. Easton from Reverend John H. Burroughs of Chicago, who is traveling in India, shows that the claims of the lonely Oriental were true and had been recognized. Burroughs said that John Joseph Nori, Archbishop of Babylon, was crowned Patriarch at the Chaldean Pontifical Cathedral at Trichy, Malabar, and is living in splendor in the royal palace. The coronation occurred in February. Archdeacon Nori's elevation to pontifical throne makes him ruler over Syrian Chaldeans of Trichy. So he was a real person with some of these real titles, and said that he had seen Noah's Ark. This is George Hagopian, who grew up in Armenia, right below Mount Ararat. And when he was a boy, he went up Mount Ararat with his uncle in 1908, and they climbed up the mountain and found the Ark site and Noah's Ark. There it was in plain view, and his uncle gave him a boost. Because he was only like 8 years old at the time, and he walked on top of Noah's Ark. And an artist interviewed him, and this is what he said it looked like. The Ark as seen by Hagopian in 1908, which fits the descriptions others have given. And then he climbed up on the roof and said it looked like this from above. Then also, in 1916, this is during World War I, there was a Russian pilot named Vladimir Roskovitsky. Some people have said actually his name was Zabolotovsky. And there was a Russian base that was not far from Mount Ararat, because Russia is not too distant away. And they were doing a high altitude flight test. And he was glad to go as the weather was hot. So a couple guys went up in the airplane. So they flew straight over to Mount Ararat, and suddenly he saw what he thought was a submarine in a lake. And his commander looked down and said, "That strange craft is Noah's Ark. You have made the most incredible discovery of the age." They went back to their base, and other people took off and looked at it as well. They reported this to the Tsar. And remember, the Tsar was a Christian. And so the Tsar sent an expedition to find Noah's Ark. 100 men, 50 went up one side of Mount Ararat, 50 went up the other side of Mount Ararat, and they got to the Ark. And it said they took pictures, they took samples, they took measurements, and they sent this all back to Russia, to the capital in St. Petersburg. And this was in 1917. And do you remember what happened in 1917? The Russian Revolution.
between rich and poor was never wider than in Tsarist Russia. They began to march in groups, singing revolutionary songs, carrying banners, peace, bread, liberty. The Tsars answered, "I forbid all meetings in the streets. I warn the people that the soldiers have been instructed to use their rifles to restore order in the capital." You see here in the main thoroughfare of Petrograd the moving body of the power that overthrew the Tsarist autocracy and initiated those events which have altered the whole course of modern history. Stop the war. Confiscate the land. Russia belongs to the workers and peasants. All power to the Soviets.
And so in the chaos of the Russian Revolution, the Communist Revolution, these photographs and measurements and samples and so on of Noah's Ark were lost. You have to remember also the communists were atheists, so certainly they would not be in favor of such a finding. But some of the people in that expedition and pilots escaped out of Russia and ended up going to places like America, where they told the story of what they saw. Another interesting thing is that when the communists took over, they killed the Tsar and his family. But some people say that the youngest daughter, Anastasia, and also perhaps the son, Alexia, managed to escape in some way, or were helped to escape. And indeed, when they first found the bodies of the Tsar's family, there were 2 bodies missing. Later they said they found the bodies, but we don't know for sure. And years later, there was a woman named Anna Anderson who showed up in France, who ultimately claimed to be Anastasia. And they interviewed her, and she actually seemed to know many things about life in the palace and the Tsar's family and all these things. And one thing she said that surprised the interviewers was that she said that in the last days of the Tsar, before the revolution, there was great excitement because they had heard the Russian armies had discovered Noah's Ark. And she said she saw pictures of Noah's Ark. Now, it is controversial whether this woman, Anna Anderson, was Anastasia or not. And to this day, there are some historians and researchers who have said, absolutely she was. She definitely was Anastasia. And yet there are others who say, absolutely not, she was not Anastasia. And so we're kind of left wondering. But either way, this is evidence for Noah's Ark, because if this woman was really Anastasia, she saw those photographs. If she wasn't, she at least heard that these photographs were seen. And so either way, to me, this is evidence of Noah's Ark. And to this day, they produce movies and videos, about the story of Anastasia. Was this woman Anastasia, or was it a conspiracy? Here's one preview of such a movie.
Remember the name of this woman, Anastasia. About her was woven one of the world's most fabulous conspiracies. And remember, whenever great motion pictures are talked about, they will speak of Anastasia and the 3 who gave it life. Ingrid Bergman as the woman called Anastasia, a stranger even to herself, a puppet in the hands of amoral men. Yul Brynner as the arch-conspirator who snatched this mystery woman from the banks of the Seine to carry out his unscrupulous scheme.
Anna! Anna, am I Anna? Why not Tamara or Lisa? Why not Tatiana? Yes, why not Tatiana? No, I don't want this. I want to be me. Whoever I am, I want to be me. I want someone to tell me, someone to accept me, someone.
Helen Hayes as the woman who alone held the key to the success or failure of this fantastic conspiracy.
Imposter!
You call me that?
If you have any decency, end this charade at once. I will pay you. I will give you more than whatever Bunyan has promised you.
Having made her the most desirable woman on earth, he would let no other man possess her.
You pushed me at Paul, and now you're against him. Why? Are you afraid that he's going to be in control?
Over what?
Over me? Over the money?
I don't give a hang about the money.
Then another interesting story. In 1942, during World War II, there was a man named Ray Lubbock who was in the U.S. Navy. And they would show them old military films, and he said at one point they were shown an old World War I Russian military film in which he said he saw the Ark. Because in the film, they were saying these Russians are going to fight the Turks. But he noticed that the soldiers didn't have guns. And he looked behind them and he saw this big structure, which he believed was Noah's Ark. And he was also interviewed by Alfred Lee, an artist. And this is the picture they came up with of what he said he saw in that movie. In 1918, Guilford officer in the military said he flew over Mount Ararat and also saw the Ark in a glacier. Then this man named Armes Arutinov, who immigrated from Russia to the USA in 1923, he had photos of that Russian expedition, which I mentioned, which now have disappeared. No one knows where the photos, but some people saw his photos and were able to describe what the Ark looked like in the photos. And that illustration is based off the description. Then this man named Ed Davis, he was in the military in the area that's now Iran during World War II in 1943. And an Iranian friend of his said, oh, that mountain way up there, that's the Ark. That's where the Ark is. And he got very interested and asked if he could be taken up there. And the friend said, well, at the right time, we might be able to do that. And ultimately, him and his relatives did take Ed Davis up Mount Ararat, a very difficult climb. He even saw a dead body on his way up. And it was very snowy. And he said at one point the snow cleared and he looked and he saw the Ark, which had been broken into a couple pieces. And he could see one large section of Noah's Ark. And then Ken Hurley, a soldier in Fort Benning, Georgia. After a church service, a lieutenant asked him if he was a Christian. He said yes. The lieutenant took him to his office and showed him this photo in a newspaper. He said it was from around 1943 when men in the Air Force in Iraq were flying supplies from Iraq to Russia, and they had flown over Mount Ararat and taken this picture of the Ark. And indeed, a number of people have said in the U.S. military's newspaper, the Stars and Stripes, there was an article and a photograph showing Noah's Ark on Mount Ararat that had been seen by U.S. pilots. People have searched the Stars and Stripes, and there's so many different editions of it. They weren't able to search all the editions and all the possibilities, but so far they have not found that article. But a number of people said they saw it. The Turks reported a ship on top of Mount Ararat in the 1940s, so a number of sightings by the Turks. Then there was this Frenchman named Fernand Navarra. He was born in 1915 in France. And one time he was stationed in Lebanon, and he climbed Mount Hermon with a friend of his named Alim. And Alim was actually from Armenia. And Alim mentioned that his grandfather had tried to climb Mount Ararat to find the Ark, but had failed, had not been able to climb much because he was not very good at climbing and could get, he couldn't get enough air. He didn't have a good lungs for climbing. It turned out Alim was the same, because when they climbed Mount Lebanon, Alim had to just kind of stop and let Fernand Navarra complete the climb. And when Fernand Navarra came back down, Alim told the story about his grandfather, and he had said that his grandfather had told him to try to climb Mount Ararat and find the Ark. But he realized he was just not the right type of person to do that, not very good at climbing. But he saw that Fernand Navarra was. And so he said, maybe you're the one to fulfill my grandfather's mission to find the Ark. And this planted the seed, and Fernand Navarra decided he wanted to do that. And ultimately, he made a number of climbs up Mount Ararat in 1954, 55, 69, and he found wood, a piece of wood, up on Mount Ararat, well above the timberline, buried under some ice, and he was able to get that piece out and chop it up and bring it down the mountain. And they did test this piece of wood, and the first tests found it to be about 4,000 to 5,000 years old. Carbon dating found it to be younger, and so some people have discounted it. But on the other hand, carbon dating has been shown to be wildly inaccurate at times. So this very well could be 5,000-year-old wood from Noah's Ark.
A French demolition engineer named Fernand Navarra first became interested in the Ark while serving in the military as a young man. Navarra began the first of a series of expeditions to Mount Ararat in 1952.
My Kurdish guides had abandoned me at the lower level of the mountain, and so I tried my best to proceed on my own. I was not able to find the Ark exposed, but I did see a massive dark shape frozen under the glacier ice. I knew then I would have to return to discover what it could be.
Navarra did return in July of 1955, accompanied by his young son, Raphael. What we see here is actual footage filmed by Fernand Navarra and his son during their expedition.
1955 was a warm year with a great glacial meltback. I know if I had a chance to reach the Ark, it would be now.
It was Raphael who first spotted something. Navarra carefully lowered himself deep into a crevasse at the 13,500-foot level.
The wood was easy to see, but was frozen into the ice. Still then, I had no idea how big it was.
What Navarra chopped from the ice was a 5-foot hand-hewn wooden beam.
I had dreamed of this. Raphael and I were excited like it was Christmas time. I tried to carry it down the mountain across my pack. It was very heavy. I could not keep my balance. We felt so bad that I had to cut the wood, but later I would have to cut it again to send out sample for testing.
A proud moment and fulfillment of a long-held wish.
And then in the 1950s, there was U.S. spy planes that flew over Mount Ararat because it was right on a border zone. And they did get pictures of the whole mountain, and there was, even in the official military records, an anomaly on Mount Ararat. An anomaly is something that does not belong there, not natural to the site. So there is a picture of the anomaly. In 1953, a geologist named George Jefferson Green, who was searching for oil and minerals and such, he took a helicopter around the Ahora Gorge and got clear photos of the Ark. By a cliff, 1/3 of it visible. Over 30 other people saw these photos he took. But then he was murdered 9 years later in British Guiana, and all the photos disappeared. Then there was Ed Bailing in 1973. He was a soldier, 23 years old in the U.S. Navy, based near the Turkish-Iranian border, and he became a friend of a Kurdish soldier named Mustafa. After 5 months of friendship, Mustafa talked to Bailing about his uncle that knew where the Ark was. So they took Bailing up the mountain, and he suffered cold and pain and was exhausted. Then his friend Mustafa pointed out to him a point with his hand. This gesture pushed him to a final effort in his climb. He looked down the canyon, and only about 20 meters down, he saw a kind of enormous black structure. It was broken with a rectangular shape, not round like a typical ship, but more square. And so that's the picture based on his description, that he saw the Ark from above. And then starting in the 70s, the Mount Ararat was photographed by satellites. And upon examining the satellite picture, even an unbelieving photo analyst said, "I don't know how this large structure got up there. It looks man-made." He said, "It's wooden. I have no idea what it is." There's U.S. President Jimmy Carter, and in the year 1977, December 31st, he was on Air Force One, and they were flying from Warsaw, Poland to Tehran, Iran. And if you draw a line from Warsaw to Tehran, you go right over where Mount Ararat is. Well, there was a photojournalist on that Air Force One with the other media. His name was Ron Bennett. And he told this story. He said, "During the flight, while we were flying over eastern Turkey, our attention was called to the window. It was a dramatic moment as Soviet MiG fighter jets were escorting us wing on wing. At the same time, someone also told us if we looked down, we would see Noah's Ark. We looked, and there was a mountain with snow and glaciers on it. There, maybe halfway up the mountain, clearly visible, was a large, dark boat. It was partially covered with snow or ice. I am convinced, based on what I saw there, that it was Noah's Ark. In my opinion, the president probably had Air Force One routed over Mount Ararat and most likely saw the Ark too." Is that interesting? But what did Jimmy Carter say? Well, in his book, White House Diary, Jimmy Carter wrote this: "We left Poland in a heavy snow and enjoyed the flight to Tehran, flying over some very interesting terrain. Although it was a clear day, we never were sure or not we saw Mount Ararat to the north." So here, this guy says he saw the Ark, and Jimmy Carter was not even sure if they saw Mount Ararat, according to what he put in his book. So we don't know what the truth is there. But it is possible that Jimmy Carter may have not been able to say he went over Mount Ararat, because maybe that was not technically allowed, or maybe it was classified information. We just don't know. This is U.S. astronaut James Irwin, one of the Apollo astronauts. And he was a Christian guy, got very interested in the Ark. His climb, I mentioned earlier, did not work out. So he did, though, hire a plane, a small plane, to fly around Mount Ararat and take pictures which they did, and one of the pictures looked like this. So isn't that interesting? So you never know. Another aspect of Mount Ararat is that being the biggest mountain around, it's the only mountain that really has perpetual snow and so has moisture and rainbows. The other mountains in the region don't have rainbows, but Mount Ararat does. And they say that the best view of the rainbow is actually from the Ahura Gorge. And so this fits the Bible story of Noah seeing the rainbow. And God knows best even about shipbuilding. This is the USS Oregon, which was a USA battleship. And the marine architect who designed this ship, he was a Christian, so he built the ship by the same scale as Noah's Ark. In other words, the same width to length ratio, about 1:6, which is what Noah's Ark was. And this ship ended up being the steadiest ship in the U.S. Navy. In fact, it got the nickname the Bulldog of the Navy because during the Spanish-American War, it managed to go from San Francisco to Florida in just 68 days to be ready for action. It became the flagship of the U.S. Navy. Those are the Andes Mountains behind me. Of course, you can't see them because of the bad weather, and that's often the case also in Mount Ararat. So, do we have proof that that Noah's Ark is up on Mount Ararat? No, we cannot prove that, but we do have enough evidence to show that it's not crazy to think and believe that Noah's Ark is really up there. I believe one day Noah's Ark will be revealed for the world to see, but probably not till later because the Ark is a symbol of judgment and it likely may be shown to the world when it's time for the final judgment. So I hope you've enjoyed this teaching on Noah's Ark, and I recommend go on YouTube, and there are many other good documentaries and movies about the Ark. It's a fascinating subject, and more information is always coming in.